Hello everybody and welcome to the War Room. This one is for Masvidal v Usman 2, the UFC 261 main event. Okay, there is a full breakdown of this on the BT Sport YouTube channel, but it has been geo-blocked. So if you're, you clever people out there that can work VPNs and the such can figure that out and find yourself in the UK so you can watch it. It's got all kinds of clips and interesting stuff. And yeah, it's unfortunate it's been geo-blocked. We're trying to fix that for next time around. But I just thought I'd get this out for you. It's going to be very similar in the flow because I'm working off my same notes that I had for that show. But obviously, I can take my time a little bit here and talk you through a couple of things. You'll have to use your imagination, though, as you can see. So, right, let me get comfortable. So let's set the stage for these guys. So on one side, you've got Kamaru Usman, who's a standout wrestler. Spent the majority of his younger years, his high school and college years, competing on the wrestling mats, proving himself in that range. Competing for respect and for acceptance and all the same reasons that Masvidal was fighting for. The difference was that Masvidal was, he was in the backyards in Florida and he was fighting in quite chaotic environments with bare knuckle. His striking skills were already very, very good. If you go back and watch those early fights where he was fighting Kimbo Slicer's protege, he was clearly the smaller fighter in there. He had long hair tied up and he was, he just moved so well even back then. And you can see how that transferred to a really successful MMA career. And a long MMA career as well. There has been a turning point for Masvidal recently. Recently. He did that reality TV show a few fights ago. And it just seemed to have... He seems to come off the back of that reality TV show and his whole focus was, live life, take more risks, enjoy yourself a bit more. And that's what's created this, this resurrection, this street Jesus that we're seeing now. That wasn't who he was when he was fighting at lightweight a few years ago. And this process of growth has been really interesting. Same thing for Masvidal. For Usman, he's grown as a champion. And we've seen skills added to his game as we've gone through. The different ends of the spectrum. So Masvidal is, he's the street fighter. He's a well-trained street fighter, but it's a risky environment. It's a risky style because he's a gunslinger. He's standing trading punches with people. There are risks to that, and that shows in his record, 35-14. He's picked up a few losses, he's picked up a lot of lessons, and that's just his pro MMA record. You've got to imagine he's had a bunch more experience that's probably not been recorded. Usman on the flip side, 18-1, a very controlling performance all the way through his career. That one loss on his record, I think, was a rear naked choke to Alex Caceres' brother. And it was, it's just one of those things. He made a mistake, had his back took, and that was that. Probably a very frustrating situation because he could quite easily be 19-0 right now, and I'm sure if he got that fight again, he absolutely would be. But their careers show you what kind of fighters they are. One's a controlling, fights out of a solid control, and one's a bit of a risk taker that rolls the dice on a few things, like we saw in the Ben Askren fight. So, when coming into that first fight, Masvidal obviously had taken it on short notice. Was it 6 days? And there's a lot of talk about the fact that he was probably preparing for it, and he expected the opportunities to open up, and he was bringing wrestlers in to prepare for it, etc., etc. Now, all of that was good investment anyway, because Masvidal was in a situation where even if he didn't get the fight at that point, he was going to fight Usman at some point down the line in the near future. It was on the cards. So, working on his wrestling, preparing a game plan for Usman was the smart thing to do anyway. The thing that would have been different was his conditioning, because, when you know for sure that you've got that fight, when your face is on the poster, when the talk is about you and your opponent and your title fight and etc., etc., those conditioning sessions, you're going to give more. There's going to be more output, more effort, more dig, more drive, more want, because that fight's yours to take. he didn't know this was his fight until 6 days before. So you can't think he came in at the same level of conditioning that he would have had it have been his fight all the way through. So that's the first thing that I have to consider for Masvidal. The other thing on the flip side is 6 days ahead, 6 days before, Usman was expected to be facing Gilbert Burns. And now we know what his game plan for Gilbert Burns was. You know, it was to manage him at a distance, keep him on the end of his jab, and defend his takedowns. I'm aware that some of this might be a bit repetitive if you've watched through the show, but at least I can kind of reinforce some stuff here. You know, if your game is control, then your control looks different depending on who you're fighting. You know, when Usman was fighting Damian Maia, the best way to control Damian Maia was the same way that you control Gilbert Burns. Slightly more risky with Gilbert Burns because, you know, he's got more power in his hands. He throws with more heat. He throws with more intensity, and the shots come from odd angles because most of them are looping shots. So the controls still look very much the same. It was just more challenging against Gilbert Burns for a lot of reasons. But it's the same kind of thing. You know, their strong skill set is the ground, so I'm going to disengage that entirely. I'm going to use this is the benefit in wrestling. This is why wrestling's not a finishing art. You know, it's a precursor to a finish. It is the glue that holds all of the other arts together. And if you have the advantage in wrestling, then you have the advantage of decision making. You can decide where the fight takes place. So that's the advantage that Usman steps into all of his fights with. And that's why, you know, when we talk about, you know, potential super fights for Usman and who would beat him, you know, Colby Covington was an interesting one because he's got a good wrestling background, but, you know, was just too reckless in the fight, took too many punches, didn't invest in his wrestling at all for probably a few different reasons. But, you know, that's when you're thinking maybe someone like Khabib or GSP would be interesting for Usman because they might be able to take that decision making away from him. Masvidal can't do that. Gilbert Burns couldn't do that. Damian Maia couldn't do that. Nobody so far has been able to stop Usman from deciding where the fight takes place. And that's where it gets really difficult to find your way into one of those fights because he's able to shut you out. He's able to close down the best part of your game. So if that's Gilbert Burns or Damian Maia, that manifests in clinch work and anti-grappling. You know, he's disengaging anytime he gets the opportunity. He's keeping them on the end of his jab and he's not allowing them to grapple. Against Masvidal, his best attribute, his skill set, is his striking prowess, his ability to you know, set people up for finishing shots, and you know, really, he's got a lot of depth and variety to his game, and I think that might be a little unnerving for Usman because Usman's, you know, he's got great straight punches, you know, a clean jab and a clean cross. He's ambidextrous. It doesn't matter what stance he's in. He can land with the same kind of power and quality from both stances. He's as accurate and as precise from both stances. But he doesn't have the depth to his striking game that Masvidal does. You know, there's a lot of variety and there's a lot of deep thought in Masvidal's game. The way he sets people up, you know, the way he programmed Darren Till to push his hands out as he level changed and came over the top. You know, that was established in the first round. You know, he set that trap up. So if you're smart, if you're Usman and you're smart, you want to take control of this fight. You want to shut Masvidal's striking down, which is what he did in their first fight. You know, Masvidal came out really fiery, you know, kick-heavy game, throwing loads of strikes, loads of inside low kicks and body kicks, and Usman immediately started trying to catch things. What was it, 15 seconds in, he hooked a leg and took Masvidal down. And then they're on the floor for about a minute, and Usman's got control. And then Masvidal's doing this. Masvidal's got this really intelligent game that he plays when he's in clinched positions. He holds on and holds on and holds on. Then when you start fighting to get free, he pushes you away. Get off, get off, get off. It's completely hot or cold. It's you're either grappling and I'm going to cling on to you with everything I've got. And as soon as you start to try and create space, I am going to try and create as much space as possible, slapping and kicking and scrambling. And that's what we saw from Masvidal. He gets back to his feet and then he starts to be very active again. You know, he's throwing lots of power shots. He's rushing with his right hand, rushing with his left hand. Usman's level changing underneath, and eventually the fight starts to slow down. And this is all the first round. You know, Masvidal's up against the fence now. He tries to break and land an elbow strike and gets himself off the fence, but you can see he's getting more fatigued as the first round goes on. And the longer the fight goes on, the easier it was for Usman to shut him down and slow him down. What can be learned from the first fight? Well, first of all, Masvidal's been in there with him for 25 minutes now, knowing full well that he wasn't as conditioned as he would have been had he been preparing for the fight from the beginning of training camp, like a number one contender. Usman knows that he can control Masvidal, and the sooner he does it, the safer, and the longer he does it, the easier. He also will be aware that there are burst attacks from Masvidal, which can be very dangerous, but they lessen in danger as the fight goes on. So a couple of things to consider for Masvidal. So one, if he gets tied up and he's put against the fence, if you watch the Cesar Ferreira fight, he's got a really nice short elbow that he kind of rolls over in short space, catches him with the top of his elbow. If that doesn't hurt them, it at least creates a space so he might be able to get off the fence or follow up with further attacks. He hit Nate Diaz with the same thing. Elbow, ran him down and then kicked him in the head as he was level changing. Those break attacks for Masvidal are going to be really useful because he'll be able to exploit the small gaps where Usman doesn't have control, whether that's because Masvidal's scrambled back to his feet because he's managed to get off the fence, or maybe because the referee stood them up. You know, this is another benefit to Masvidal's control and release tactic, because if Masvidal's on the bottom and Usman's not working, there's no threat for Masvidal, but there's also no benefit in Masvidal starting to strike himself, because if Masvidal from the bottom position starts to open up, then the referee will let them work. Whereas if Masvidal's in the bottom position and he's just holding on and controlling, it puts all of the responsibility on Usman to maintain a position. You know, he's got to create space, he's got to strike, he's got to try and pass and improve his position. So there's a real benefit in Masvidal if he finds himself in the bottom position, just kind of clinging on. Usman will need to keep the fight moving at certain points, but when the fight starts to move too quickly, he'll need to reel it back in again. So it's like, you know, he's got to manage the temperature of the fight. It can't get so cold that the referee gets bored and stands them up, because you guarantee if it's on the feet, it won't be doing that. You know, maybe against the fence. The clinch work and the ground game is where there's the potential for this fight to really slow down. Whenever it's at distance, whenever there's space between the two of them, Masvidal will always be working. Even if it's just his mind working, his footwork, trying to see where the gaps and the traps are. As soon as they close down, though, Masvidal can, to an extent, kind of start to rest. And if he finds himself clinched and he's resting and he's just being difficult and defending the odd takedown and scrambling back to his feet, then the referee sets them and he's got a burst attack again. And he can maintain that burst attack while ever he's dangerous and he's got space. But then, you know, he might get taken down, and then he clings on and he holds and he waits and bides his time and he rests. And then the referee stands him up, or Usman creates space and Masvidal scrambles and pushes him away, and then he's back to a break attack. I hope this is making sense. So they're the moments where Masvidal gets his way into this fight. It's going to be difficult to create those opportunities, and the more effort he spends on creating those opportunities, the less he'll have to expend in striking volume, because, you know, Usman's not going to let him just walk off the fence. He's going to make him work for it. If Masvidal's taken down, Usman's going to make him work for it to get back to his feet. And okay, well, let me just quick move into the grappling range now, because so if Usman takes Masvidal down against the fence, Masvidal will immediately, especially in the early rounds before he's tired, start working back to his feet. So this allows Usman to make Masvidal work without him being threatening at all. Usman can force Masvidal into this cycle, this grind cycle that DC uses and Khabib uses, and and he will just slowly drain Masvidal, and that's the best and safest thing to do for the first 2 rounds. Put him in that cycle up against the fence where Masvidal's doing reps of wall walks, cage walks. I mean, that's a conditioning drill in most MMA gyms. It's draining to do. And if you've got someone as good as Usman holding you down and controlling you and striking you in the same time and stamping on your feet and punching you in the body and you know, that kind of stuff, it's going to drain you even further. And then you get those burst attacks, and in Masvidal's head, he's like, I've got 15 seconds now to be impactful. So he's now throwing everything the kitchen sink at to Usman, who's just walking him down and placing a jab, switching his stance, placing a jab. Like, Usman's all about managing the pace of the fight and slowly painting Masvidal into a corner where he's exhausted and he's breaking and he can't continue because he's got nothing left to give. And then that's where Usman starts to take top control. He starts to land ground and pound. He starts to work for arm triangles. I think most people going into this expect it to be very similar to the first fight. And I think you would be right. I think it'd be very similar to the first fight, unless Masvidal can find a way of doing something different. You know, he fatigued very quickly in the first fight. You know, at the end of the first round, you could already see the fire was gone in his strikes, and he had a couple of bursts maybe in the second round, and I think a little burst in the fourth, but really not much. And even at the end of the first round, you can see Usman now. He drops his hands and he's like, now he feels the threat of Masvidal starting to wane, and you know, he can start to impose his own game. So coming out of that first performance against Masvidal, Usman then went into the Burns fight, which was the original matchup where Masvidal stepped in. And this, in my opinion, was Usman's best performance by a long, long way. It was easier to have a good performance against Gilbert Burns, given the fact that he knew that Gilbert Burns would be throwing powerful overhands and hooks, but really wants the fight on the floor where his ground game comes into play. I think Gilbert Burns knew coming into the fight that he wouldn't be able to make that decision to take the fight to the floor, and I think he knew that Usman would be able to stop him and make it very difficult for him. I think the one thing people didn't expect was how effective Usman's straight punching would be, and he chambers it so well. He holds his fist right close to his shoulder, so there's no drawback. You know, most fighters, if they've got their hand out ahead of them, they won't go from here to here. They'll go from here, and there'll be a slight retraction before they go. It's like cocking the hammer of a gun. You know, you cock it and it shortens the trigger, makes it easier to pull the trigger. If you don't cock it, you can still pull the trigger, but you've got the drawback first. It's an additional effort, an additional movement. And this is where Usman is so effective, because he's not punching with venom, because he's not there to, I'm going to punch, I'm going to knock you out. He sees his opportunity and he just places with power. You know, every one of his straight punches is like a piston. You know, we saw it in the Colby Covington fight. We saw it when he dropped Sergio Moraes, closed him down, short right hand against the fence. Damian Maia dropped him in the third round against the fence with a right hand as well. His straight punching is by far the best facet to his striking game. And a good jab, especially someone that's ambidextrous, that can just slip their head off the center line and keep firing down the middle, he's problems for anybody. It's problems for anybody. It doesn't matter how good a striker is. And with the constant threat that Usman can level change, drive him into the fence, it may allow him to push Masvidal around. It may allow him to tire him out in the first round, part of the second round, and then keep Masvidal up against the fence where he can just jab and cross his way into range. And if he falls a bit short, then he can fall into a clinch. And Masvidal's very accepting of the clinch against the fence because he knows he's got good takedown offense against the fence. If Usman wants to take Masvidal down and control him, taking him down away from the fence is going to be the better thing to do. And I think he discovered that in the fight. Whether it was known going in or whether it was a realization as the fight went on, every time he took Masvidal down against the fence, Masvidal was able to scramble back. Very similar to the Emil Mech fight. When he took Emil Mech down against the fence, Mech would scramble back to his feet. When he took Emil Mech down away from the fence, then he was into Usman's wrestling game, and that's problems. Because he constantly folds the arm, elbow chop. He's pressuring him with his shoulder. He's binding his legs. He's got such good oppressive top control that he doesn't establish very well when people are up against the fence. As soon as he takes somebody down out in the open, then he starts to work to very advantageous positions like the back or like mount, where he can start working that arm triangle that I mentioned. Haida Hassan, that's the fight with the arm triangle. But there are a few times he sets it up. He attempts it against Emil Mek, but he manages to bail out of it. So with that in mind, Masvidal has to keep the fight moving. He has to keep the fight. If there's a situation where Usman is trying to take him down out in the open, away from the fence, that's where he's got to invest some of his cardiovascular energy. He's got to invest in getting back to his feet there. Watch his Rustam Habilov fight. The scrambles in that were amazing. He even got knocked down with a head kick and then went into a 90-second scramble, which was awesome. I think he's got good wrestling ability, and I think if he keeps scrambling and keeps moving, at least scramble to get back to the fence, so he's got an additional limb to lean on in the fence. He can walk his way back up. I think that would be the smart thing to do. The other things that Masvidal's got to offer, especially if he's able to stay on the front foot, if he's able to be a bit more aggressive at points in the fight, backing Usman up and then skipping in with that lead or rear knee is going to be really useful. It's going to discourage Usman from level changing, and might be able to catch him with something. And I know we've all seen the Masvidal Askren knee, but again, the Rustam Habilov fight, he throws knees several times in that one, and he catches Al Iaquinta clean with a jump rear knee. So it's definitely something in his game that he's been using for a while. And if he does find himself up against the fence, he has this wicked guillotine roll. He used it against Ben Henderson. There's a whole bunch. Michael Chiesa used it against Chiesa. Clamps onto a guillotine, slides down against the fence, and then kicks his opponent over and tries to scramble to top position. Doesn't always get there, but certainly it keeps the fight moving. And if he doesn't get to a better position, and if he does get to a better position, then he can start attacking that neck. He's got a good Darce attack. Caught Michael Chiesa with it, but has attempted it on a few people. He almost got Cruikshank with it as well. Okay. What have I forgotten? I mean, the drowning pressure of Usman, is evident. He spends nearly 20% of his striking effort is done in the clinch, and nearly 30% is on the ground. I mean, he really is able to work over his opponents at close range. You're looking at half of his game is striking in the clinch, striking with physical contact with his opponent. What else have I got to say about this? I mean, it's 74.7% takedown offense for Masvidal. I think that stat's lower because of takedowns that have happened out in the center. I think if you looked at his takedown offense stat up against the fence, I think it would probably be closer to 85-90% because he has got great takedown offense against the fence. So, it works against him sometimes. Sometimes he accepts being up against the fence. Sometimes he'll allow his opponent to drive into him and, give him a bit of a rest. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that because I don't think he should come into this fight trying to win every minute. I think that would be quite a foolish waste of energy for him. And the one other thing we have to consider when it comes to Masvidal as well is that he does his research. He will have watched the Gilbert Burns fight. He will have watched his own fight back against Usman. He will have really considered it. He plays off like he's not really bothered and like he's real casual and thumbs up to the camera before the fight starts. And but he takes this very seriously. He knows what he's capable of. He also knows his margins for error in these fights, and that's what he's going to be examining. And also the margins for error for his opponents and how he can exploit those moments. Masvidal does his research. He'd watched the Ben Askren-Robbie Lawler fight. He'd watched Ben Askren's previous fights in ONE FC and seen how he level changes with his head over to the hip of Masvidal and timed that knee perfectly. I saw it come up the other day. If you can't admit that that knee was a fluke, then you don't know what you're watching. If you think that knee was a fluke, then you don't know what you're watching. Masvidal had watched that tendency in Askren's game. He drilled it. He'd measured that attack. He'd decided that's what he was going to roll the dice on. And this is what I'm saying at very start of the show. He's a risk taker. That was a risk, of course. it's not a fluky knee because he had pictured that exactly happening in his head. The thing that was lucky about it is the possibility of it actually landing, which was fairly slim. But it doesn't make it any less considered. It just means that, his success rate was relatively low and he rolled the dice on it anyway. People like crazy odds on things, and Masvidal's a risk taker. Like I said, you wouldn't get Usman doing that because that would put him at unnecessary risk. It would be a poor calculation, and that's just not the athlete that he is. He's not the fighter that he is. He's a competitor. He comes in here to win and compete, and there's a beauty to that. We saw that in his jab. There's a little venom in it, but ultimately it's about scoring that point and making the most impact. For Masvidal, there's venom in his game. It doesn't mean there's not a technical ability there. And he flows through attacks so well, attacking different ranges, different targets. Jab, cross, body shot against Jake Ellenberger, comes up the center with a knee, hurts him with that, goes back to the hands, then a knee, then an elbow. There's lots of similarities in these top 3 fights on the card. And the volume that Jessica Andrade throws at her opponents is similar in a way. But Masvidal does the same thing with more accuracy and more consideration. He is varying his attacks, but he's also looking at his attacks. Whereas some like Andrade's a little bit more chaotic in the way that she swings. She just kind of goes for what she sees in the moment. Masvidal's baiting one target to open up others. It's a whole new level of comprehension of striking, and there are very few fighters, honestly, in the world of competition that I see with the ability to read. And the one that always stands out to me is against Darren Till, and he's backed up against the fence, and you'll see it. He kind of postures with a left hook and holds it there for a moment, and then he backs up, and it's like in that moment you can see him reading, because as he throws it, Darren goes, and he puts himself in the same position that he put himself when he got knocked out. And I said this to someone the other day. Sometimes when you're sparring in the gym, someone's got a lazy jab, someone's got a Ben Askren jab, and somebody comes over you can come over the top and catch somebody with a right hand clean. You don't need to hit somebody hard with that punch to let them know it was there. And oftentimes with beginners, people that are kind of finding their feet, and I'm trying to teach them to keep that chin tucked as they throw their jab. Sometimes if they throw that lazy jab and keep their chin tucked, I'll just tag them with that right hand to let them know it's there. It's almost like Masvidal did that with Darren Till. It's almost like he went, I see where you're going to be. And then he set him up for it. So the premeditations of Masvidal is something you have to consider as well. Average fight time slightly higher for Usman. Inch height, 2 inches in reach for Usman. It will make very little difference in this one because, majority of the time he's going to want to have his hands on Masvidal when he's striking him. And the other thing as well is that straight punch that he's got, he's very direct and to the point, but it's more about the timing of the application. This is something I've not touched upon. So if you watch the very opening seconds of Masvidal against Ellenberger, you'll see him kind of bounce in and out, bounce heavy on his lead leg, like he's tempting his opponent to do something. It's like, come on, you go first and then I'm going to counter you. That's going to be difficult for Usman to deal with, because if he's constantly trying to hit Masvidal while he's using that movement, he's going to be forced to step with his jab, which gives Masvidal the opportunity to counter. Like, reading Usman's jab's really difficult. It's going to be a challenge for Masvidal. And if Usman's able to walk himself into punching range, he's going to be able to tag Masvidal with that jab all day. If Masvidal's forcing him to step into that range, that's a different thing, because that gives Masvidal an additional moment to read the movement of Usman moving towards him. So that's something to consider there. Where are we? Strikes landed per minute, slightly higher for Usman, but again, 50% of his strikes are landed, once he's got his hands on his opponent. So that considerably elevates your striking accuracy and success rate. Strikes absorbed per minute, slightly higher for Masvidal, but also his defense is slightly higher. But again, he's a risk taker. He puts himself in circumstances where he does take the odd shot and lands his counters. Of course, takedown average is going to be higher for Usman. He's 100% takedown offense as well. I don't expect Masvidal to try and take Usman down, but 77% takedown defense for Masvidal is, it's considerable. It's not the highest in the division, but it's definitely up there. And I think, like I said, it's higher if you take into account takedowns against the fence only. I think he has more success there. Slightly higher sub-average as well for Masvidal, but how often is he clamping onto those guillotines to roll people through and sweep? That's my biggest question. Okay, so if Usman beats Masvidal again, then who, if anyone at 170, has the skill set and ability to beat Usman? Maybe nobody. Maybe nobody. That's the reality of it. There are a couple of people that come to mind. The first one, without me even looking at the rankings, is Leon Edwards, of course. Leon's got to get his shot. He's got to get his shot. I think, you watch that first fight, and I think there are moments in there where Leon's improved from that fight. Times when he was stuck on the floor, where his scrambling ability's gotten better. I think his butterfly hooks are stronger now. I think he's able to unsettle his opponent's base better. And I also think he's more confident with his ground game. It wouldn't surprise me if we saw Leon actually engage Usman on the ground as well. That's the one I'm keeping my eye on. I think Chiesa's an interesting one, given the fact that he's got such good subs, but I think that would mean that he'd get shut down and forced to deal with the striking of Usman, which I think would probably better him at this point. Who else? Colby Covington. I'm not really interested to see that one right now. I'd quite like to see Colby get Masvidal, to be honest, before that. But Leon's the one. I'm keeping an eye on Luque as well. I think he's on his way up the rankings, as well as, if we're going right down to the bottom of the rankings, I'm keeping an eye on Sean Brady as well, because he's a powerhouse, heavy-handed. But right now, the only one that really excites me, aside from this Masvidal rematch, is Leon Edwards. Mainly because, they went 3 rounds the last time they fought. It was a competitive fight where Usman had the advantage in control. And I think they've both gotten better. I think Usman's striking's gotten better, and I think Leon's scrambling and grappling confidence has gotten better. So that's the answer to that one. Easy question. Why is Usman so disrespected? He's clearly a force to be reckoned with in MMA currently after John Jones. Just why? Boring or not, he always gets the win. Okay. It's not an easy question. It is something I have been considering, because I watch these fights as a fan as much as I watch them as an analyst and as a martial artist. So I appreciate what Usman can do. To be able to control another human being, to be able to drown them with pressure, and I understand why people get frustrated with his performances. When the fans, and you've got to think, the majority of people watching these fights, what did we learn from the BMF title? People aren't really interested in who's the best in the world. They're interested in who the best in the world is if that person who's the best is also terrifying, if they can knock people out cold. Like Stipe Miocic was the best in the world at heavyweight. Now Francis Ngannou is the best in the world, and people are far more excited about that. There's a reason for that, and it's not any slight on Stipe. It's just that most fans aren't watching. They're not watching to see who technically has the advantage and who's able to bring the best game plan and who's on point with their conditioning, etc., etc. They're looking for those highlight reel. This person got starched. Ben Askren, Masvidal. Like those kind of knockouts, those kind of circumstances, what the majority of people are watching these fights for, which is absolutely fine. They are the more casual MMA fans, and they're the majority of the people that are bringing the money into this sport. So, when you've got someone like Usman that, he's holding somebody up against the fence, and full well that he's got control of the fight, but he's not making an effort to instigate a finish, that's when people start to get frustrated with him. And the Gracies always talk about fighting out of a good defense. I think Usman's in a different place, because fighting out of a good defense puts you in a victim situation straight away. If you imagine it shifting through gears, if you can go from defense to attack, but most of the time people go from defense to control to attack. They have to turn the fight around in that order. Otherwise, it's they're chaotic back and forth where no one's really got control, and it's kind of a shot in the dark as to who wins. Usman doesn't fight out of a good defense. He fights out of a great control. And fighting out of a great control allows him to manage the fight, but it also allows him to take the fight where he wants it to go. And I think oftentimes when people are watching Usman fight, if they don't feel like he's consciously trying to instigate a finish, that's when they start to kind of fall out of love with his fights. And it's not that he can't finish people, because he can, absolutely. We've seen that. It's about choosing safety over over risk taking, which is why one of them's the welterweight champion of the world, and one of them has a belt that says "bad motherfucker" on it. And the reality is, if you put that BMF belt on the line again, and it was a rematch between Masvidal and Nate Diaz, even if Masvidal loses this fight to Usman and Nate Diaz loses his next matchup, you put those two boys together, and that's going to sell massive amounts of pay-per-view. Because the reality is, people aren't that bothered about who's the best in the world. They're bothered about who's the most attractive to watch. I mean, I'm recording this the day after, or a few hours after, Ben Askren and Jake Paul. And that analysis got almost as many views. Well, no, it got more views, actually, than the Kelvin Gastelum Robert Whittaker fight. But there's no doubt that both of those guys are better fighters than the two guys boxing in that main event. But people don't want to be invested full-time in a sport where they have to follow the rankings and see who's on the top all the time, which means they don't have the appreciation for someone like Usman that can shut down an entire division like he has. They want the spectacular knockouts and the highlight reels and the catchphrases and the "I'm not surprised, motherfuckers" and all that kind of stuff. That's why Usman struggles with his popularity. And I think if he doesn't allow that to bother him and continues to develop his skill set like he is, I think he'll naturally become much more of a finisher anyway. I don't necessarily think that we're going to see that in a Masvidal fight. I think him winning by decision is the most likely thing to happen. But if he's matched correctly with someone that is, has a massive deficit in one way or another. See, Masvidal's got good scrambling ability, but he's got great striking. So if Usman can control him and take him down, then he can nullify that major skill set. But that does force him to physically control Masvidal, which is where people start to get restless. In a fight with Gilbert Burns, when he doesn't have to physically control them, he uses his wrestling to stop them physically getting their hands on him. Then he's in a position naturally where his striking will express itself, and that's really what the layman fan is much more interested in seeing. That's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think that's it. Usman's a fantastic competitor, but the majority of people watching MMA, their instinct is to choose a tribal leader. You're looking for the person that you follow into battle because you get confidence from them when they stand on the front line and go, with their battle axe. It's a stupid thing to say, but we're animals and we're tribal, and that is in our DNA. And when someone's, got 4 or 5 beers in them, they regress back to that state where they get to they get the just bleed vibe going. And, Masvidal speaks to everybody, and Usman doesn't necessarily speak to those just bleed guys, at least not at the moment. Who has more ways to win and more advantages, Masvidal or Usman? Well, the two answers to this, Thunters, is that your name? There's two answers to this. Masvidal has more ways to win. Usman has more advantages. Masvidal has more ways of winning. He has more variety in his game. He's got, neck attacks. He's got guillotines and Darce chokes. He's got flying knees. He's got beautiful boxing. He's got good body kicks, inside low kicks. He's good at switching ranges. He's good at switching stances. There are lots of different ways that Masvidal could potentially win this fight. But they're all a scattering. If you look at that one channel in which Usman controls and manages this fight. And when it comes to advantages, wrestling being the main advantage, strength and conditioning being another advantage, and also patience is another advantage. Like Masvidal is going to be the one fighting in the short burst, the opportunities to attack. Usman's going to control the majority of the fight, and that patience will pay dividends for him. So I think the answer is that Masvidal's got more ways of winning, but I think every single one of those ways that Masvidal can win is less consistent than the one clear way that Usman wins this fight, which is by a dominant decision. Okay, have I covered everything? what have I got written down here? 16.38 minutes of control in their first fight. So we got about 9 minutes of liveliness out of 25 minutes. It's those 9 minutes of liveliness that Masvidal's got to lean into. 65% of Usman's striking is on the feet. I've got written down here. Hang on a minute, what's that? Yeah, that sounds about right. He also got 5 of 16 takedowns in their first fight. That's the one thing I'll leave this on. So again, if he wants to exhaust Masvidal, taking him down against the fence and forcing him to work his way back to his feet over and over again is the fastest way to do that. Taking him down to control him is best done out in the open, because that forces Masvidal to deal with Usman's wrestling game, and it forces him to deal with those problems presented to him out in the center of the mat with wrestling and jiu-jitsu instead of MMA scrambles, which is a newly developed skill for everybody in the sport. But it's far easier than dealing with the wrestling ability of Usman out in the open. Okay. I hope you can get over to BT Sports YouTube and watch the other one, the full one with all the clips and the fanciness as well. It's probably just as long as this one, but hopefully it makes a bit more sense with the pictures and the fancy animations and stuff. So get your VPN sorted out and go and figure that out, and put in the comments where you're watching from, just for a bit of fun. Right. Thank you for watching. I hope you made it all the way through to the end here. Masvidal Usman 2. Enjoy the fights. See you next time.